Number 1.
We all understand that seeing is believing. The thing we don't understand is what happens when you reach past the point of believing and start knowing. It can be terrifying, because that's when you realize that they can see you too. This is a true story. When I was 17, we moved into the 3rd floor of an old shitty apartment building in an old shitty apartment complex. The only saving grace to this community was that it was surrounded by a spacious lawn of green grass and had tall trees for privacy. A few weeks after we moved in, I noticed that certain objects weren't where I had originally left them. They would show up in random places hours or even days later. One day it would be my keys. The next day it was my wallet or phone. Once I even found a small stuffed animal inside of a toilet tank. It was causing the tank to back up, so I looked under the lid. In hindsight, I see how these occurrences were a warning. Things got much worse when the nightmare started. Before bed, I would always close the closet door and switch on some kind of nightlight. It always felt like there was something unseen living in the dark, and that it was afraid of the light. When the nightmares first started, I assumed it was just an ordinary thing. Everyone has a nightmare once in a while. However, these nightmares were different. They were so lucid and graphic that I would wake up screaming in a different room or even outside my apartment. I've never had a problem with sleepwalking, but these dreams were having a physical effect on my body. With the stress of a new move, things disappearing, and my lack of sleep, it was safe to say that I was constantly on edge. But then again, so was the rest of my family. It seemed that we were all ready to be at each other's throats at the drop of a pen. It got so bad that things became physically violent between my mother and me. I love my mother, but I will never forget that fight. Without getting into too much detail, it ended with her hands wrapped around my throat. Once she realized what she was doing, she burst into tears and ran into her room, leaving me shaken and wondering how all this could have escalated over something as trivial as a tape dispenser. Later, she apologized and told me that she didn't know what she was doing until she, and I quote, snapped out of it. At the time, I had a small powder white Maltipoo named Bleach. She was an incredibly sweet and affectionate dog who loved everyone. I kept her in my room when I was in school or at work. She had her crate, bed, and toys in there, so she was pretty content until I got home. One night I opened the door to my room and saw Bleach in the corner, shivering. As soon as she saw me, she hobbled up to my foot and started to cry. I immediately scooped her up and examined her. Her leg had been bent in a 90-degree angle away from her body. I had no idea how long she had been like that, scared, alone, and in pain. I absolutely fucking lost it. I wrapped Bleach in a blanket and screamed for my mother. I handed the small bundle over to my mom and told her to call the emergency vet. Then I stormed directly to my brother's room. I knew he had something to do with this. I'm certain my mother wouldn't do anything like this. And my brother had been told that he was not allowed to play with Bleach until I got home because he was way too rough with her. After pounding on his door and screaming at him for a moment, my mother called down the hall to me to inform me that he wasn't there. He had left for camp that morning. I felt my knees go weak. I couldn't understand. What had happened to my dog? The vet later said the break was clean, as if it had just been snapped. Fast forward a couple of months, and Bleach made a full recovery, and her cast had been off for a few weeks. Things seemed to finally be getting back to normal. The nightmares had gone away, and my keys were staying where I had put them. I returned home from school one afternoon to see my brother sitting on the couch with Bleach on his lap. His hands were stacked on top of her, seemingly holding her down. She began to struggle, and he let her find her way to the floor. She makes her way over to me, and I can see that she's hobbling again. I bent over to carefully pick her up. Her leg was broken, and it was turned away from her body, just like last time. But it wasn't the same leg as before. My mother walked through the front door just as I finished processing what had happened. I turned to face her and handed her the whimpering animal. Then I turned to face my brother. I had seen her on his lap. I saw him holding her down. Without thinking, my fist connected with my brother's face. He hit the floor and I pinned him on the ground, screaming about how cruelty to animals is the first sign of a sociopath. And how could he do this to a defenseless dog? My brother is 6'4", 200 pounds. I asked him if he was going to kill my pet. Then something happened that I've never been able to fully process. His facial expression changed. His eyes went hard in a way that I had never seen before, and his voice went deep as he leaned forward and whispered into my ear,
"Yes, and I'm going to kill you too."
I pushed myself off of him in sudden shock, and he immediately started crying and said that he never meant to hurt her and that he doesn't understand what happened. Luckily, the vet was able to mend this second break as well. After the second incident, I decided that it would be better if I found a new home for Bleach, and I couldn't stand the thought of her continuing to get hurt. I cried the entire time I was driving to give her away to her new family. I never saw her again. Fast forward a few weeks. Since I no longer needed to be home to take care of my dog, I called a close friend and I asked him if I could vent about all the shit that's been happening to me lately. I met him at a local coffee shop and just started unloading everything that had been happening. And I didn't withhold anything for fear of sounding batshit crazy. I'm sure anyone who was listening in would have thought that I was off my meds. After recounting the last 6 months, I sat there quietly and waited for his reaction. I expected him to call me crazy and walk out. Instead, he took a sip of his coffee and calmly stated that something was intentionally making my life a living hell. I thought about it for a moment. What if it wasn't all accident and misfortune? Something was doing this to my family, to my dog. I started going through everything mentally, putting the pieces and fragments of thought together. On the way home, I couldn't get the idea of something being the cause of my family's distress out of my head. All of a sudden, I started getting upset at this supposed entity. How fucking dare this thing? When I got home, I quietly went into my room without saying a word to my mother or my brother and sat down on the bed. I started talking to the empty room and whatever was potentially there. I don't know if there's anything here, but if there is something here, fuck you. I paused, waiting for a response. When nothing happened, I continued. You leave this place tonight. Do you hear me? Fucking leave tonight. This is our home. Satisfied I had gotten my message across, I got off the bed and went into the living room to join my family and watch a movie. I must have fallen asleep because I remember waking up on the couch and groggily getting up to go to bed. I walked into my dark room and flopped down onto my mattress. My closet was directly across from my bed. I can see that the door is open, but I'm too tired to give a damn. I awoke an hour or so later extremely thirsty. It hurt to breathe. My throat was dry, and I staggered out of my room and walked into the kitchen. Still half asleep, I managed to get a glass of water. I stumbled back into my room, holding the glass, feeling my way through the darkened doorway. I took one last sip and placed the glass on my nightstand. My head hit the pillow, and my gaze wandered over towards the closet. That's when I saw it. It was hunched down inside the closet amongst my clothes. Its face was stark white and gaunt. Its eyes were black as pitch, encased in deep dark circles. Its mouth was black and thin. It had what looked like dirty, stringy hair hanging down in its face, but those were just the physical features of this thing. The expression on its face was nothing short of a nightmare. It wanted me. It hated me. I got the sense that despite the short physical distance between us, something was holding it back. But if this entity had the opportunity, it would have torn me apart. I was too terrified to move or to scream. I was barely breathing. I just remember staring at it until the darkness behind it seemed to swallow it up, and I passed out from exhaustion. I woke up to sunlight flooding into my room. I jolted out of bed, remembering what had happened just a few hours ago. My head snapped towards my closet. What was that thing? I started trying to convince myself that it had all been a dream, but I glanced down at my nightstand and saw the glass of water sitting there. The strange occurrences had stopped, but I didn't sleep in my room again for another month, and I always close my closet door.
Number 2.
There has always been something in my closet. I'm not talking about one specific spot and one specific location. No matter where I moved to and lived, this thing has always followed me. Over the years, I've tried almost every possible option to try and rid myself of this thing. Seances, mediums, Ouija boards. I even had a priest come once to perform an exorcism, which evidently is nothing like in the movies. Nothing has ever worked. Fortunately though, this thing has never become angry or aggressive despite my attempts to banish it. It just stands by passively in my closet and watches me, like a shark in a tank watches as people try to scare it away from the glass. I don't know what it is exactly, but I've long since resigned myself to its companionship. Every night, a few minutes after I climb into bed, my closet door slowly opens, and I see 2 pale orbs reflecting whatever moonlight sifts through my curtains and into my room. At first, when I was a child, it horrified me. I remember countless nights in which I would remain frozen stiff as my closet door noiselessly opened. I would breathe as shallow as I could to be inaudible, terrified that any movement would cause the thing to attack. Many nights were spent in this deadlocked silence, neither of us moving. Of course, my parents chalked it up to the typical child's nightmare of a monster in the closet and gave me a nightlight. This only made things worse. With the nightlight, I could further make out its nebulous, elongated shape and see its pale marble eyes with even more clarity. The next night, I told my parents I didn't need the light anymore. During sleepovers as a kid and a few passionate flings as an adult, I noticed that the closet door would open only slightly, if at all, as if the thing did not want others to realize its existence. This, of course, instigated a campaign of sleepovers, as many as I could have, to avoid seeing the nightmare in my closet. Sometimes I would attribute my current promiscuity to a conditioned response. I mean, why sleep alone when you can have company, right? Despite this indisputable logic, my female friends will still jokingly call me a man whore. And they're not wrong. Eventually though, people can get used to just about anything. Even closet demons watching you while you sleep. I live alone now, my former roommate having moved in with his fiancée. I don't know if it's the solitude of these recent nights, but lately the thing in my closet has felt closer. I was returning home last night, pleasantly buzzed. After a few rounds of post-work happy hour drinking, I got off the bus and walked up to the front door of my 2-family home, noting the lights off in the upstairs apartment. I fumbled for my keys, and just as I turned the key in the lock, I felt a hard-pointed object jam into the small of my back, sending electric pain pulsing up my spine.
Do not make a fucking sound, bitch, or I'll kill you. Walk slowly and don't do anything stupid.
The mugger grabbed my shoulder and pushed me through the doorway. My heart was pounding and adrenaline shot through my body, causing me to shake as though I were naked in a freezer. I did as he said and we entered my living room, and I struggled to find my voice. Please, just take whatever you want and go. The man shoved me and closed the door behind him. I turned to him and saw a man of average build, wearing a green army jacket stained with brown patches and black pants. His face was covered by a black knitted mask with 2 eye holes haphazardly cut out. Something that under different circumstances might have been humorously cliché, but in this moment only served to make the scenario even more terrifying. He grunted and pointed a black revolver at my face, causing me to instinctively recoil and put my hands out in a supplicating gesture.
Shut up and give me your wallet.
He thrust out his free hand and encouraged for me to expedite the process by waving his gun. I took out my wallet and gave it to him. The man opened it with one hand, the gun never wavering its aim from my skull.
Okay, Matthew. I'm going to give you 5 seconds to tell me where you keep your valuables.
Adrenaline-fueled panic mixed with inebriated stupor produced a delirious mix of terrified and calm. From this, my brain decided that sarcasm would be my best choice for survival. Valuables? I'm an unmarried 27-year-old living in a shitty 2-family house. What kind of valuables do you think I have? The man responded by walking over to me and smacking me with the butt of his pistol against my head. Pain immediately washed over me, and my vision blurred. I had never been hit so hard before in my life. My head throbbed violently. I could feel the blood trickling down the side of my face and mixing with the tears in my eyes. The man stood over me and shouted,
"Do you think I'm fucking joking? I will kill you tonight. What the fuck do I have to lose? Now get the fuck up."
He clicked back the hammer of the gun.
"This is your last chance."
I commanded my legs to support my body, but they were wobbly and weak. I used the table next to me and managed to get to my feet. "In my room," I said weakly. The man grabbed me by the back of the collar and elbowed me in the direction I had pointed. I stumbled along, feeling hopeless and genuinely believing that I was going to die. When we reached my room, I tried to turn on the light, but nothing happened. I looked at him apologetically and shook my head, causing me to wince in pain. He grunted and told me to get out of the way. He pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and told me to show him where. I pointed at the top of my dresser and said, "In there. I keep my money behind the socks." The man found a thick wad of $50 bills in an envelope where I had told him. It was $1,000. He turned to me again and said,
"What else do you have? Do you have a safe somewhere?"
Just as my brain queued up another sarcastic remark, a wisp of an idea crept into my mind. "Yeah, in the closet." He pointed at my closet door and said,
"In here?"
I nodded. The man walked towards the blackness, the old floorboards creaking with each step. It seemed that the rectangular frame of the door was swallowing up any light attempting to pass beyond it, and the small light from the man's flashlight was rendered virtually ineffective. He stepped forward, into the closet. I could just hear him whisper,
"What the hell?"
when the door to the abyss slammed shut, ringing out like a gunshot. A split second later, he was screaming, slamming and loud thuds boomed out of the closet door, and the man who had attempted to rob me yelled as though a meat grinder was pulling his limbs apart. The man's screaming soon turned into wailing, and I could hear him pleading for me to open the door. I just stood there paralyzed and shocked. Suddenly the door swung open. His mask was torn but still clinging on to his bloodied face, as though anonymity would somehow protect him from the terror that ripped and clawed and slashed at his soft body. Through the ripped mask, I could see 4 deep red chasms in his flesh that extended down from the left side of his face. Pulsing blood poured down his body from the wounds. His right arm had been pulled out of his socket and was hanging limply by his side, the white bone protruding from his torn skin. Our eyes met for a second, and we were the same. 2 men experiencing something beyond our comprehension that instantly shattered whatever belief we had in the order and transparency of the world. I hadn't realized it, but until then, the thing in my closet was just a horrifying idea, a construct that couldn't affect nothing more than a draft of air. Then everything snapped back, and an enormous black claw radiating dark fumes from its skin came slamming down onto the man's back, with the sound of a pitchfork crashing through the wet mud. It then pulled him back into the darkness. After a minute of muffled, futile struggling, all sounds emanating from the closet ceased. I stood there, immersed in the deadly silence. Then the door to my closet opened soundlessly, and I could see 2 pale eyes, with newly defined pupils gazing out at me. I nodded slowly and walked out of my room, stepping over the pool of blood that was spreading across my floor. I woke up this morning on my couch with the feeling of a nail being steadily driven into my skull. I called in sick to work. I left a dark stain on the spot where my head had bled into the fabric. The throbbing pain was an instant reminder of the previous night's gruesome violence. I stood up and made my way to my room. The sun lit up my small home, which in contrast to last night, made the space look almost charming. I entered my room, expecting to see brutal carnage, but stopped in surprise. No grisly, forcibly detached limbs on the floor, no trace that the man who had tried to rob me had ever been there. The only thing aside from the stitches that I would have to get for my head to confirm what happened was the wad of money that lay on my closet floor, right next to the shreds of a black, knitted mask.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
This experience left me pretty shaken up for a while. To begin, I was a fairly depressed and antisocial 15-year-old in high school, and on weekends I'd go and stay with my older sister in her apartment to get away from my parents and finally just relax. During this time, I'd gotten into studying astral projection, and I'd always been interested in the paranormal, as my mom and I had experienced things in our house, and my mom claimed that she could see the spirits. Anyway, one day after some reading, I decided to take the bus over to Toys R Us, where they still to this day sell Ouija boards to kids. I bought one of the silly glow-in-the-dark ones. My sister and I were really excited to start using it. Within a few minutes of putting our hands on the planchette, it began moving in a circle. Our first introduction was a little girl named Sarah. We end up chatting with this little spirit all night. Then, it turns into every single weekend. We begin to feel almost addicted to the board, always going to chat with Sarah. It was a long time ago, but I remember her saying that she was from the 1800s. She'd be so excited to talk every time we showed up. The planchette would spin in circles all over the board. We could even take our hands off of it, and it would continue to move. The addiction to the board goes on for months. Finally, one day we decide to ask Sarah to physically show us that she exists. We ask for a sign, and a strong breeze shoots straight into my ear so hard that I jumped back from the board. There was no AC on, no windows open, and no fans in the room. From here on, things get odd, and Sarah says that she is attached to me. I started getting an off feeling, and I ask, "Are you really Sarah, or are you someone else? Some of the things you say are pretty adult for a young girl." Then the planchette began to playfully spin all over the place, ending on no. I feel a sense of almost maniacal laughter in the air. It's hard to explain, but my sister feels it too. Turns out Sarah was actually a man named Solomon. Solomon said that he loved me and that he was going to follow me. From there, we were freaked out and decided to stop using the board, but the pull was strong, and it legitimately feels as if it were an addiction. After this incident, I can almost always feel someone watching me when I'm alone. I'd see the shape of a man in my head, and the dark windows at night, but just for a second, enough to make me think I was losing my mind. I was frequently exploring church with my sister and was so scared from seeing figures pass by the windows and from feeling someone standing behind me that I told the preacher about our Ouija board use. He said he would pray and that I would have to ignore the spirit. Not the greatest advice. A month later, I had an odd and terrifying dream. Suddenly I'm above my body and in the den in my parents' house where I'd fallen asleep on the couch late at night. I look down at myself and then feel a presence by my body's head behind the couch near the hallway. There is a man standing there. He's wearing a black leather jacket, fitted, vintage-looking jeans, dark boots, kind of 40s, 50s-ish biker style. He was probably in his mid-20s. He had pale skin, dark short-cut hair, and totally black eyes. He's almost attractive, if he weren't terrifying. He smiles at me eerily, and at light speed jumps for my body. I panic and jump too, trying to get back into my body before he does. I wake up in a panic, sweating and shaking. Somehow I eventually fall asleep at first light. And then when I awaken in the late afternoon, my mom tells me that she woke up to use the bathroom at night and fell to the ground in the living room having a seizure. I didn't know what to do or say. I was shocked. Could it have been from the paranormal encounter? Because she's a sensitive too? She used antidepressants frequently and switched them around a lot. But what a strange coincidence for it to happen that night. After that incident, life just continued on. So much of my teenage life felt negative at that age already that I just kept trekking forward, feeling someone behind me on some days not. The energy in my family's home was generally bad. Parents fighting constantly, father using drugs, mom in different phases of her bipolar. Definitely some energy a bad spirit or two could feed on. Fast forward to sophomore year in high school. I used to sit in the corner in band doing homework quietly, and one day a girl known as the school witch comes up to me. We'd maybe talked a few times, but didn't know each other very well. She simply states, "So there's a man following you, a spirit. I'm going to do a spell for you tonight to make him leave." Once again shocked, I tell her that there has been someone following me. She nods like, yes, obviously, then walks away before I can say anything else. By junior year, I'm dating a boy who lost his brother to suicide only months before we'd met. One night he calls in a panic and states that he was brutally attacked by a male spirit or demon in a dreamlike yet awake state. He said he felt someone sitting on him and could see a black spirit in the room. He called his brother's spirit to save him. He claims he felt a whoosh of energy and that his brother pushed the spirit off of his chest. He woke up really scared, saying that he'd never felt anything like it and that he'd never had negative spirit encounters before except as a small child. What scares me is that he'd randomly have episodes after this that made him not in his right mind or almost mad. At the time, I'd felt and seen his brother's spirit twice, and it was never a hostile feeling. I felt somewhat protected while dating him because of this, but Solomon's negative spirit was something I still worried about and felt on occasion. Years go by, and I eventually become best friends with a girl whose family ghost hunts. We ghost hunt together, experience some creepy stuff, and I become less fearful. 2 years into our relationship, I get the courage to tell her psychic aunt my story, and she seeks to find out more about this spirit. She connects with him and laughs some. He's 5150, hun. He's absolutely mad. He's not necessarily evil, but he attached himself to you because he likes how easily he can scare you. He doesn't necessarily want to hurt you, but your fear gives him pleasure. In life, it seems, he was quite mentally ill. I was absolutely stunned. It all made so much sense, and how would she know this? After the talk, my best friend and her aunt tell him to F off, and to imagine a white light and to let him know he's not welcome. This seems forward, but one night I feel the presence and it angers me. Years of someone just wanting to scare me. I yell at the empty room that I'm not afraid of him and that he's not welcome. I use sage, imagine white light, and yell for him to leave. I feel a stir in the energy, almost like he's not even that angry to leave. It felt more like an annoyance at losing his fear target. From that point on, I've had the upper hand. There was one more experience with him one day at 25 while in a toxic living situation. This was 6 years after the experience with my friend's aunt. I left my body again and was excited. Finally, astral projecting as an adult. I sit up, and lo and behold, there he is, standing by the bed. But this time I shoot white light at him. He's gone in an instant. Then my toxic roommate at the time walks through the wall to grab me. I wake up. Was he trying to warn me? Does he still visit me? Can I ever make him leave for good? Sometimes I wonder if he ever felt compassion for me. It was all so strange, and I frequently meditate and banish negative spirits or energy from around me. I've shut down a lot spiritually because of these incidents. I constantly state that nothing is allowed to bother me, but I wonder if somehow he'll be there forever. It worries me sometimes, especially because he'd stated on the board that he didn't want anyone to have me. I feel confident that spiritually I am strong, but I've always wondered if there was some deeper level of banishing that I could have, or should have done, or could still do. Anyway, I wanted to share this story because it's been both such a weight and a mystery to me for so many years. I don't know what I believe anymore. Sometimes I wonder if my extremely negative state of mind drew him to my depressed teenage self. Maybe somehow I created this negative entity? I doubt that one, but it is still possible. I feel in a much better place mentally, physically, and spiritually now, so I don't feel threatened by spirits, or really believe that he is around anymore. But who knows? I sage and cleanse my place almost daily and feel it to be a safe and light space. I will say that there is still so much I don't know when it comes to all of those incidents. This is a long one, but this is a true and factual story about my experience. I'd like to start by saying that I am very skeptical when it comes to things people claim are paranormal. I don't just jump to conclusions that a strange event is caused by spirits, but some things I just can't wrap my head around or explain. I won't say that what happened to me and what I experienced was from a spirit, because I don't know 100%. All I know is that I'll never touch a Ouija board again, or be around one, because the experience disturbed me for the better part of a year. Also, I'd like to add that this is only one of 2 paranormal events that I've ever personally experienced that I can say 100% that I don't know what happened. Here we go, starting with the background. I used to think that Ouija boards were a load of crap. I still kind of do. I really don't know how I feel about them anymore, actually. I always saw them as a party game for gullible people, so when my friend Joe, not his real name for privacy, told me that he had one, I just laughed it off. I had only known Joe for about a year or so after meeting through mutual friends. He lived in a small apartment with his girlfriend Lisa, also not her real name, and their dog Vincent. At the time, I was only 18. Joe was like 23, and Lisa was 20. For a period of time, I used to go over to their place every weekend after work because Joe bought me alcohol. So one night we were hanging out, and Joe starts talking about some strange encounters he had growing up and how he, quote-unquote, attracted spirits his whole life or some garbage. I smiled and nodded to be polite while he went off on paranormal tangents and started talking about shadow people following him. He then goes into his room and pulls out a Ouija board, but not the one that you get at a store made by a toy company. It was made of real wood and hand-carved. It was actually pretty nice. He said that he had gotten it as a birthday gift from his parents years ago because of his obsession with the paranormal. I didn't inquire as to where it had come from or who made it, but like I said, it looked handmade. While I sat there laughing and joking about it, Lisa chimes in and says, "Joe, tell him about the other night." Joe proceeds to tell me how him and Lisa allegedly spoke to a demon using it, and the demon claimed that his name was Beelzebub. Me being a big metalhead at the time, he got my attention. "Let's do it. Let's try to talk to this demon," I said, half joking. Joe asked if I was sure that I wanted to try it, and I agreed. So we went into his room. We turned off all the lights in the apartment. Lisa lit candles all around the room and we sat on the floor. I was nervous, but I was having fun watching Lisa and Joe's pageantry. It was spooky. I looked over at Joe and he seemed unsettled. I asked what was wrong, and he said that he wasn't feeling right. He didn't like the doors open displaying the darker areas of the apartment. Him and I got up and closed every door in the place, as in every room and every closet. We sat back on the floor and Vincent, the pup, laid on the bed. And we began. I forgot to add, this is very important. Before we started, I told Joe that I was skeptical of someone using their fingers to push the planchette around. So we all agreed to just use the back of our fingernails to touch it. Imagine just slightly bending your finger and placing the surface of your nail on the top. That's what we did. That way, even if you added pressure, your finger just slipped around on the planchette and didn't actually move it. We also made a rule. If the planchette moves, everyone has to lightly scratch the planchette with their nail to prove that none of us were the ones making it happen. What it looked similar to is placing your two fingers on a table and acting like they're legs and running in place. I hope that helps you get the picture. No one was able to move it on their own. We tried several times to ask if there were spirits with us, and got nothing. For about 20 minutes it continued that way. I told Joe I wanted to ask for someone in particular. Is John Smith here with us? Can John Smith talk to me? John Smith, obviously once again not his real name, was the name of my best friend's dad who was killed in a car crash while driving home from a fishing trip. That was when it moved, and it was absolutely insane. It felt like a great force just came to life in the planchette, like it had a mind of its own. None of that gliding around the board crap that you see in movies. This thing felt like we were holding onto a person's hand who was tugging and pulling. It was strong, but articulate movement, and it spelled out, "Hello." I asked him if he was John, and it spelled yes. I asked him to prove it, and it spelled out the name of my best friend. I asked him where he was when he passed, and he spelled Lake. I had chills down my spine. What I thought was just going to be fun had turned into being emotional and scary. Joe and Lisa knew nothing about John Smith. I never mentioned him or brought up anything about the circumstances, so they couldn't have known. I began to grow very unsettled. I told Joe and Lisa that I didn't want to talk to John anymore, so they told me to push the planchette to goodbye or whatever it was. I called it a night after that, but I wanted more. Next night, I was back. Same routine, John and Lisa set up the room, John closed all the doors, Vincent was on the bed. Lisa said that she wanted to talk to her grandma, so we did the process. It was the same incident for her as it was for me. Memory is kind of fuzzy, but it spelled out "I love you," and also spelled out some sort of inside joke that she used to share with her grandmother. Lisa was in tears. As with me, I had no info on her grandma, and Joe wasn't that cruel to make her cry as a joke. I felt powerful. I think we all did. I felt like I was finally a believer, that we had an actual way of talking to spirits. The possibilities. But then it happened. After the incident with Lisa's grandma, we were all kind of in shock. Joe was comforting Lisa, and I was speechless. We regained our composure and got back to it. This time we were asking the normal, "Are there any spirits with us?" What usually left the planchette lifeless suddenly kicked in with great force. Scary force. The planchette moved violently around the board. We all kind of laughed nervously. We asked, "Who are you?" The planchette shot to to the moon symbol. If you don't know, this allegedly means a dark spirit. We all looked at each other and then simultaneously moved the planchette to goodbye. As soon as we did, Vincent jumped up and ran off of the bed. He sat and stared as if looking at someone. We had that door closed before. Joe jumped up and said, "F this," and ran into the kitchen. Lisa and I followed. Joe about nearly had a panic attack. He rushed to turn on all the lights. I've never seen him act that way. We were all pretty scared. We don't know what happened, but we had that door closed, for sure. After some talking and calming each other down, I left. I didn't sleep that night. I had never seen anything like that. After that night, I felt like I was being followed constantly. For almost a year, I slept with the lights on. That year ended up being one of the worst years of my life. I fell into a depression and was incredibly paranoid. I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was always watching me. I continued to go to Joe and Lisa's place occasionally, but we never touched the board again. We ended up having a falling out some months later over unrelated drama and never communicated after that. Like I said, that year was horrible for me. I started drinking a lot and tried to get over the feeling. I always felt like my energy was being sapped, like the air was heavy, and I struggled to find joy. The depression was real. Then the experience hit a peak. I was sleeping one night and woke up in a panic. I couldn't breathe. I felt as if someone was literally sitting on my chest. I gasped for air. Suddenly, I felt like what was someone grabbing my feet and trying to pull me off of my bed. I instantly went into a struggle, trying to kick out as hard as I could. Then all at once, it stopped. I was horrified. Nobody was in my room. I lost even more sleep after that incident. I ended up finally getting a hold on my life. I started going to the gym instead of drinking and wallowing in my pity. I started meditating instead of playing video games. After that year, it all went away. It was like I was free from that negative energy again, and I have been fine ever since. That's the story of my Ouija board experience. I'm still not sure if all of it was in my head, or if that night was just some sort of stress-induced panic attack, but whatever it was, I cannot explain it. People have told me that demons thrive off your energy, and that is what might have happened, but I'm just not sure. Perhaps it was the demon talking to us all along, pretending to be our loved ones, if such a thing exists. I'm just glad that whole experience is in my past. I'll never touch a Ouija board again, though. I was 13 years old, 2003. My friend and I were bored and decided to have some weird fun. Now, I've always had interest in supernatural and occult-like things. I've always been very empathic and in tune to things in a way that's hard to explain. Anyways, I didn't have a real Ouija, so we used paper and drew one, and then used a quarter for the planchette. We asked if anyone was there and if they wanted to talk. Of course, there was nothing for a few minutes. Suddenly, the feathers of my dream catcher in my room started to sway. No open window or AC on. We asked again if anyone was there, and then it felt like there was a pull. We allowed ourselves to let go and just see what happened. It went to the yes. We asked what its name was, and we felt pulled towards D and C. Just those letters, D, C. Odd. A minute or so later, my grandma called for us that she was ready to go, as we were about to go to the mall. We stood up and walked out of my room. My friend looked at my face and gasped, and told me to look in the mirror. I had about a 2-inch scratch on my face that was not there before. We were a little freaked out, but mostly confused. We went shopping and my grandma asked what had happened, and I told her I really didn't know. The next morning, the scratch was gone. After that night, however, things got pretty bad. My room for some reason started to feel colder than the rest of the house. Even my grandma commented a few weeks later that my room was, quote-unquote, cold as death. My dog stopped coming into my room as well. He would stand at the doorway and I would call for him and he would just look at me and leave. He might come in rarely for a minute or so, but he would never stay. I started to get feelings like I wasn't alone. The air felt thicker, the dark seemed darker. When I was home alone, I would hear things, footsteps and creaking. One night, it all came to a head. My grandparents went out to dinner and I stayed home. I was downstairs playing on the desktop and instant messaging my friend. The bathroom door next to me had been shut tight, but made a clicking sound. The knob had turned and the door had opened slowly. I got up and slammed it shut. I went back to playing my game and instant messaging when I heard a loud crash. I got up and saw my grandparents' crucifix that had been hanging on the wall, on the floor. I put it back and turned on as many lights as I could, and the TV, and just took my mind off it all. Around this time, my grandma, who is very Catholic, started getting into more New Age things like crystals and psychics. She went to one and the psychic told my grandma that she had a granddaughter who saw orbs, but that these orbs I had been seeing were angels protecting me. It is true that I had been seeing a lot of flashing lights that I called orbs in those months. Fast forward a year or so, and some things happened to me that I won't go into here. Depression and hospitalizations and boarding schools. When I got home from boarding school, my grandma told me that she had spent a night in my room. She had laid down to go to sleep, and suddenly heard a cranking noise. She said she remembers thinking to herself, "Please don't start playing music," and then my music box started playing. She said she bought a lot of different incense and played a special prayer on repeat for days and basically prayer bombed the whole house. When I returned home, my room felt clean, like whatever had been there was gone. Safe. I stopped seeing the orbs as much. I never played with a Ouija board again, but I do love the designs. I have a Ouija board mug and a Ouija board mat on my dresser. I like the symbol and am not afraid of them, but I will never use one again. I have been tempted through the years to try again, hoping that maybe being better prepared I can have a safer outcome, but I just don't know if I want to take that chance of opening a door to any stranger knocking. When I was in middle school, I went to a friend's birthday party sleepover where we did the typical girl things like painted nails, did makeovers, and watched a movie. It was all normal until my friend suggested that we make a Ouija board. On a sheet of paper, we scribbled out yes, no, goodbye, along with numbers and the alphabet. She told us all the rules, and we nodded in agreement that we would follow. I remember the first movement happening, and I looked across to the girl facing me, insisting that she had moved it. She said that it was not her that moved the clear pebble that we were all using as a planchette. We asked it dumb questions like who we each liked and if our crushes liked us. Typical middle school girl things. I don't remember much of these sessions other than a particular name, Wanda, and that we had asked her if she was a demon and that she had told us that she was not. After a while, this was no longer scary and we began to enjoy it more and more. I remember feeling so excited, like I just wanted to keep on playing as if it were a video game. The next day I told my dad about it. My family was pretty open-minded about those things, so he wasn't mad or ashamed, he just wanted to make sure that we were all safe about it. Fast forward, and I was in my first year of college over at a friend's place for her birthday, and she had talked about how she found a Ouija board and that we should try it. I was a little hesitant, as now I realized the true implications. We eventually started setting boundaries, but I was still hesitant to believe that the planchette was actually moving on its own. My friend asked questions like, "When's my birthday?" and "What's my name?" I shifted to questions not about myself, tending to ask about the entity rather than me. My friend suddenly asked if the spirit knew my deceased grandfather's name, and it spelled out Lewis. I was in shock because none of my friends could have known that. I know that I hadn't directed the planchette to the letters, so I was surprised to see that it was correct. Later on, another friend of mine had said that she felt something grab her foot under the table. I was right next to her, and I didn't feel a thing. At that point, I was like, okay, let's say goodbye and call it a night. It was all just too weird. I've never had a truly bad experience, but it's still very creepy, to say the least. This happened to me when I was in high school. I was at my friend's house at the time, who lived in an apartment building. She had a neighbor who lived upstairs, and was a few years younger than us, who we hung out with when I visited my friend's apartment. On this specific day, my friend's neighbor mentioned that she had a Ouija board, and asked if we wanted to use it with her. We both agreed, as I personally didn't think Ouija boards were actually paranormal, and thought it was a myth. We went into a garage area of the apartment building and put our fingers on the planchette. For the first few hours, nothing really even happened. Eventually, we had movement on the planchette and started asking questions to this spirit, who would answer us. I forgot who, but someone asked if the spirit was trying to communicate with anyone. Interestingly enough, it spelled out my name. I was skeptical, and thought it was one of my friends messing with me, so I asked what its name was. It then spelled out my grandmother's name, who died 6 months before this Ouija board encounter. I started getting a little uncomfortable, as my grandmother's name is in another language, and my friends did not know this language, nor have I ever told them what her name was. They wouldn't even know how to spell it either. Weirded out, I asked what my grandmother wanted. She started spelling out URGR, and then the planchette started going in weird circles, and even going off of the board, and wasn't spelling out anything that made sense. So I asked for further clarification, and then just "You are great" popped up. This will be important later, so keep that in mind. Anyway, at that point I thought it was just one of us moving it weirdly, so I said goodbye. A few days later, my grandmother's husband, my grandfather, suddenly passed away. It was unexpected, as he was in great health, and it was right before Christmas, and he was so excited for Christmas. As I was at his funeral, I remembered sitting there and thinking about the Ouija board, and that's when it hit me. When my grandmother initially tried to spell out something that started with GR, I realized that grandfather starts with GR. But then the planchette had moved around so weirdly when my grandmother couldn't spell out the rest of the word, as if something had been stopping my grandmother from completing the word and warning me. The next few months were hell, as I started blaming myself, and was convinced that I had somehow contributed to my grandfather's death by using this board. It got to the point that I became suicidal, and the scariest part is, my thoughts felt as if they were not my own. As if something were trying to lead me toward taking my life, as they were very dark. I can't explain it, as it could have been guilt, but I felt like something was watching me all the time and felt a strange presence in the next few months after using the board. There's also the fact that the night of when I used the Ouija board, I was in the bathroom and I was underneath some lights. I had a strange sensation and felt that I needed to walk away, but right when I did, the lights shattered and would have injured me if I had been standing underneath. I eventually confessed to my mother about the Ouija board experience, and right when I did, I felt a giant weight lift off of my shoulders. The negative and dark thoughts were slowly disappearing, and I started to not feel the dark presence anymore when I overcame these thoughts. However, I was still wondering if the spirit that I had contacted was even really my grandmother. I also wondered if I was imagining this dark presence and the dark thoughts that I had had. Fast forward, I was at an overnight event at my school and another friend brought a Ouija board. I decided to use it one more time with this friend and try to get some answers. At one point, the Ouija board said that it was trying to contact me specifically. When we asked who it was, it then started spelling out D-E-V. We started panicking, but then it spelled out to a word that I forgot. I dismissed it and thought it was nothing, but my friend decided to look up the word. A few weeks later, she told me that the word meant devil in another language. It was then confirmed to me that it may not have been my grandmother who was contacting me the first time. There is also the fact that there may have been something that was trying to get to me and did not have good intentions. To this day, I am convinced that this spirit only tried to warn me about my grandfather so that when he passed, I would have felt guilty. By feeling guilty, I was more vulnerable to the spirit's influences, to the point that I would almost take my own life. I do not know if this is what actually happened, but it's the only logical explanation that I have. I first discovered the Ouija board when I was 14. A girl was visiting from America, I'm in the UK, and she told us how to talk to ghosts. 8 of us went to her house and made a board with ripped bits of paper and a turned wine glass. 4 of us would put our fingers on the glass, and we would swap someone out every so often. This way we believed that it would eliminate anyone who might be pushing the glass. I'll add here that the finger that had been in the glass always felt cold afterward. Don't know if others have noticed this. The first few days were spent asking silly questions like, does so-and-so fancy me, or who will I marry, etc. On the 3rd day, things took a darker turn, and we started getting responses told to us without asking. It started saying things like, so-and-so will get run over, and X will die of cancer, and other really freaky shit. This scared us, and we stopped playing. Years later, in my early 20s, I shared a flat with my brother and boyfriend at the time, and bored one night we decided to do a Ouija board. So we made a board, as I had when I was younger, and set to it. It didn't take long for the glass to move, and we asked who it was, where they came from, and how they had died. It told us its name was Bill. He was an old hippie, and he had died from an overdose. Anyhow, things went on for a while, then my boyfriend, who was convinced that we were the ones pushing the glass, said if there's really a ghost here, prove it. I kid you not a second later, the lights went out. At that time, I had one of those old-fashioned meters that you had to put money in, so after my initial shock, I reasoned that I needed to put a coin in the meter, and stood up to do it. But before I got to the door, the lights came back on. Somewhat spooked, I sat back down and me and my brother put our fingers back on the glass. My boyfriend point-blank refused. The glass then spelled out, "Chilly trick, hey." After that, it kept going in circles and moving toward me, so I decided that enough was enough and said goodbye. A few years ago, after Facebook started and I got back in touch with my old school friends, I heard that one of them had died of cancer in his late teens. Not sure about the other prophecy, but I know that I'll never do a Ouija board again, and I firmly believe that we do tap into forces beyond our 5 senses. I was 19 years old and a trainee manager for Sainsbury's. a UK supermarket chain. I was working with a colleague on the shop floor, looking down the aisle. I saw a 30-something-year-old mother pushing a very severely deformed child in a wheelchair. Although I wasn't aware then, but since have become aware. I wasn't aware then, but since have become aware that the child had probably been born with hydrocephalus, leaving its head distended with fluid. The child also only had one arm, and was sort of curled up in the chair as if pained. As they passed us, we pulled our restocking trolley out of the way, and just as they were adjacent to us, the child let out a terrible sort of howl. To be honest, it left me shaken for several minutes. 2 or 3 days later on the weekend, I was invited to a party at a friend's place. Just a quiet meal and drinks with a few people that I knew. After food and a few drinks, the girl whose flat it was suggested that we try the Ouija board that she had recently bought. I was a total skeptic of the Ouija, although agreed to play for a bit of fun. It was a proper sort of wooden painted board, although there was no pointer, just a small crystal glass that those playing put their finger on. After about 20 minutes in, I thought it felt a bit odd the way that the glass felt like it was gliding so smoothly over the board and actually spelling out some of the responses to questions, and even claiming to be a local spirit of our town. We carried on for a while, and, although weird, nothing about the responses were threatening or unpleasant. My friend turned to me and said, "Ask it a question that nobody here or anyone else would know the answer to." I thought for a few seconds and spoke aloud. I was thinking of the child in the store, and I said, "What did I see at work the other day?" I felt the glass move under our fingers, and it said quickly, very positively, "Effing evil troll child." I felt physically sick, and was actually heaving. I jumped away and fell onto the floor. I then blacked out for a few minutes, resulting in my friends calling an ambulance in panic. When it arrived, I had calmed down a bit, and they just checked my vitals and left. My friend drove me home, and although I was all right, I had nightmares involving that child for several months. Today I believe that there are definitely consequences to messing with that sort of stuff, and it is absolutely best left well alone. That was over 25 years ago, and I remember that incident as if it happened just yesterday. When I was younger, my mama would leave me home alone with my older brothers. As soon as she would leave, they would pull out a hidden Ouija board and play around on it. Of course, I wasn't allowed to be part of the game. I was probably around 6 or 7, and they were in their late teens. I can remember so vividly these memories. Mama left, and the boys went into a bedroom off the kitchen where the board was hidden. They closed the door behind them, and I was left watching cartoons by myself in the living room. The bedroom door had a gap under it, about 1.5 inches tall, and I would sometimes quietly go lay on the floor and watch them play with it through the gap. I can remember them making contact with a spirit one night, and they asked its name, to which it replied, Tobias. Each time they played after that, it always seemed to be Tobias reaching out. For about a week they conversed with this spirit, and nothing out of the ordinary seemed to come from it. However, one night, as I was watching them, the board started talking about me. My brothers would always write down the things being communicated and read them aloud, which made it easy for me to eavesdrop on them. As I lay there on the kitchen floor looking under the door, the game became active and my brothers started writing. I saw both of them make eye contact and look at each other, confused. My oldest brother said, "It said we are being watched?" As they looked around the room, I snuck back to my cartoons. They opened the door and checked on me, then went back into the room. I crept back over to watch some more. This time, the board used my name. I recall my brother saying, "It says Bianca needs to go away." I could feel the blood leave my face. I knew my brothers hadn't seen me watching. I got up and pretended to be sleeping on the couch, and eventually just actually did fall asleep there. I was awoken in the middle of the night by a strange sound, kind of like the sound a cat makes in its throat when it's mad. I sat up and cleaned the sleep from my eyes. After sitting there in the dark for a moment, it seemed to go quiet in the house. I was getting ready to get up and go to the bathroom, but I felt unable to stand, almost like something was pushing down on my shoulders. Then suddenly, it was like I was in a wind tunnel. I remember Mama's sheer curtains were whirling around, and it felt like they filled the room. I felt so dizzy, and then it just stopped. I don't remember going to sleep at all, but I woke up on the same couch, and it was daylight outside. I have never spoken about this to anyone, but the story doesn't end there. My brothers continued to mess around with the board, which I was no longer wanting to be around. It got to the point that weird things were happening to them, too. They would talk about it amongst themselves, and I would play oblivious. One night, my brothers walked out of the bedroom with a rolled-up sheet and scissors. They told me that they would be right back, and walked out the door. The next morning, I learned that the board had said some things that really frightened them. They took it down the road to the old iron bridge near our house to cut it up and throw it over into the water. We were all sitting in the kitchen eating breakfast when we heard a loud crash outside. We ran out to see a car had wrecked on the bridge. My brothers were sure it was because of the Ouija spirit that they thought they had disposed of the night before. The person who wrecked happened to be a person that my brother went to school with. He told my brother that he wrecked because as he was driving over the bridge, a demon-like figure appeared next to him in the car. He later found a piece of the board in his car, and nobody knows how it got there. This is a story from my life that I've told to people, especially teens, to warn them to never use a Ouija board. When I was a senior in high school in 1989, my brother came home from college on spring break and told stories about him and some friends using a Ouija board. It had done some things to freak them out, so we dug out the one that we had in our attic. I don't know why we had it or where we got it from. He showed me what they had done, but nothing happened to us. I brought it to a friend's house and we tried it out a few times over the course of several evenings, and then about the third or fourth time, it really started to pick up in its responses. We had been starting by knocking 3 times on the corner of the board and saying something like, "Come, spirit," or something to that effect. Anyway, the marker really started to move around the board and spell things out. I always tell people that it was either our subconsciouses or a spirit moving it around, because I was certain that neither of us were moving it intentionally. With a light touch of a few fingers from each of our hands, it would just move around on its own as if it had its own personality. We would ask it all the usual questions, test questions, and curiosity ones. One day, though I wasn't a fan of it, my friend asked the board in which years we would each die. It spelled out something like 2040 or 40-ish for my friend. I don't actually remember the number, just that it was far into the future at the time. And 1990 for me, which was the next year. I asked, "Does that mean that I'm going to die in 1990 and my friend in 2040? No, it said. Then I asked again, this time switching the years around between us. Yes, it said. We asked the spirit about itself. It claimed that it had died the year my friend's father was born, and said that its name was Stephen Crane. We kinda laughed at that part. Of course, I looked up some dates about the author after that, but things just didn't seem to jive. I just thought, well, it could be another person with that name, and moved on. We started to invite other friends over to watch, who were all entirely skeptical. By the end of the evening, every single one was freaked out. More and more friends would come each night until we started getting a huge group of people. The board would answer plenty of test questions wrong, but then, for example, while everyone's reacting to the wrong answer and half paying attention, it's spelling out, "sorry." Another time, for example, in a lull between activity while people were distracted and chatting, it moved slowly to S, then kept circling around to H, until it came to a stop there. There was nothing else for about 2 minutes. The entire room of people was completely silent, and then it slowly moved to OK. It said a bad spirit had passed through the room. Once again, everyone freaked out. It didn't like this one friend, and every time he entered the room, when we had those gatherings, the marker would twist and move to the opposite side of the board. Other things like that happened. Again, it was like it had its own personality. I remember a few times driving home with that thing in the back seat of the car, terrified, with my heart pounding. One time I asked it, "Where will I go to college?" It spelled out one of the schools I was applying to, and then 37. I asked it if I was going to go to that school and get a 3.7 GPA the first semester, and it said yes. I was sure all along that my friend was not moving it intentionally, but I had proof, because one day he was really disturbed and frustrated with his girlfriend, a friend of mine. He had suspected that she was cheating on him, and he asked the board a question about her while using it with a friend, and it told him to turn on the TV. The video for the song, "What You Don't Know Might Hurt You" by Exposé was playing on TV. I remember that he really took that to heart, and it affected his trust in their relationship. I always knew that he wasn't just playing around with the board, and that was a sort of hard proof to that fact. We started to actually use the board with our friends, but it only worked when one of us two used it with someone else. We asked the spirit why that was, and it responded that the spirit was inside my friend and that I was the owner of the board. Freaky stuff thinking back on it now. But as an 18-year-old, you think differently. Anyway, the enthusiasm started to peter out after a few months, maybe near the end of the summer, and I don't really know what happened to the Ouija board. I did end up going to that college that the board mentioned, but it didn't really catch my attention. When I got home from my first semester after 1990 had just begun, I got my grades, and had a 3.7 GPA. I don't remember if I made the connection or not, but I certainly did when the next thing happened. Around the same week or so, maybe even around the same day, I got the annual catalog that my college sends out, with articles and updates and whatnot. I opened it up, and there, right in front of me, was an entire article about Stephen Crane. He had gone to my college for a while, and I never had any clue about it. I remember having chills. Finally, the sad part is that later in 1990, after returning to college classes after Thanksgiving break, my friend, one of my best friends, died suddenly and unexpectedly from a heart problem. I don't know when I made the connection with the board, because by then it was over a year later. But at some point, I did, and when I did, I started to put the whole storyline together. It sank in more how creepy and dark the whole thing was. I am happy in life, very blessed. I did go through a form of spiritual growth some years ago where this darkness was left behind, and the story of my past doesn't haunt me. I share it in the hope that it's helpful for others. But I would never touch a Ouija board again, and would strongly advise against anyone else using one. To this day, I'm still positive that it was not our conscious action at work, but either our subconsciouses or truly a spirit. Whichever of those you might believe that it is, nothing good comes from playing around with either one of them. At the minimum, negligence can open up a path for psychological and emotional problems. At worst, relating with a spirit can let in a darkness and fear beyond your understanding or strength that can tint your life and affect you for quite some time to come. When I was younger, I used to be obsessed with ghosts and all sort of haunting shows. Now, I'd never particularly had a reason to believe that my house was haunted, but one day my brother came home claiming to have found $10 out of nowhere. I'll never know for sure if he was just messing with me, but after curiosity got a hold, I asked him where he really got the money from. Stupid me assumed maybe a friend? Perhaps he stole it from my parents' wallet? My parents never claimed to have been missing any money, however, something they definitely would have voiced being distraught about had they noticed that we had taken their cash. The story he gave me was that a young girl, maybe about the age of 7, had followed him onto the school bus that afternoon. He had never met this girl before, and had never seen her around at school, but she decided to sit in the seat right in front of him. After riding the bus for a while, she started to talk to him. Nobody else could see her according to him, and the other kids were giving him weird looks. Eventually, she handed him $10 with a note, and then subsequently got off the bus at the next stop. I immediately assumed that he was lying and laughed, of course. I asked him to show me the note, which he promptly retrieved from his room and passed me a tiny piece of paper. A shiver ran down my spine, as the note wasn't in his handwriting. It read, "I'll help you, but only this time," which I believe was in response to the fact that my brother was begging my parents for a Zelda charm bracelet for months, which they refused to buy him. Given that he had $10 now, he could just buy it himself, though. Of course, I was extremely intrigued by this, even if it sounded absurd. I suggested we make a makeshift Ouija board to see if we could contact anyone. So we wrote the alphabet on a piece of paper and grabbed a necklace to hover above the DIY board. My brother was interested too, so he decided it could be fun. Mind you, I was in 6th grade and he was in the 4th at the time, so any sort of movement from the necklace caught our attention and we immediately thought that it was a ghost. After asking a few questions, the necklace began to move and shake. Either my brother was really good at tricking me by slowly sliding the necklace across the board, or it really was something paranormal. We were able to get a name. Kate. After asking dumb things like, "Did you watch me complete the Shadow Temple in Ocarina of Time?" and getting a yes, me and my brother decided to stop for the night after starting to get creeped out. We never said goodbye before ending. Eventually, playing with the board would be a daily occurrence. We thought we'd made a friend, and truly believed that someone was talking to us. Me and my brother decided to take things a step further and try to record something. So we both got our tablets, placed them in front of our TV, and hit record. The first thing I asked was, if someone was here, move something in the room. There was nothing. Okay, well, maybe the ghost is shy? We decided to repeat the same question, but this time we said that we would leave the room and give it a minute. We went downstairs for 5 minutes, and when we got back up, our tablets had both fallen to the floor and stopped recording. Coincidence? I mean, things fall, especially when you're not careful at placing them. So we brushed it off. In December of 6th grade, though, things got really weird. I had started hearing voices in my head, claiming that they were the ghost I was talking to while playing the Ouija board. I got so scared one night that I had grabbed the Bible that one of my religious friends had gifted me, and would sleep with it. Eventually, I told my mom that there was a ghost telling me scary things. I won't get into detail, as some of it was a little graphic. She and my dad argued for a while about whether or not I was schizophrenic, and if I should see a therapist. So, out of fear, I never told them that I was hearing voices again, but I would space out often, talking and having conversations with this thing that I believed to be a ghost. Eventually, I forgot about the ghost, and we no longer talked. I will never know what that voice was, if I was genuinely insane, or if they were just intrusive thoughts. I was just glad for it finally to have stopped. Nothing necessarily paranormal has happened to me since, besides my TV turning on randomly in the middle of the night, or feeling that someone was pushing my legs with some sort of unknown force every once in a while. I sum it up to just be my imagination playing tricks on me now, but I do still have this looming feeling that ever since I've played with that Ouija board, I have some sort of spirit attached to me, following me. Not a bad one, but just a constant presence. I just had the scariest experience. I lost my ex over a year ago and had bought a Ouija board in desperation out of longing to communicate with him. I tried countless times, and it never worked, so I stored it away. Yesterday, my current boyfriend's good friend passed away. Suicide. I didn't know him very well. Today, I had a random thought to maybe try to communicate with him. I pulled out the Ouija board and asked to speak with him. It wasn't working until I closed my eyes, and then it started to move. It went to yes. I then asked it to give me a sign that it was really him. It went to the number 9. When I asked what this meant, it just kept going back to the number 9. As it's moving, I heard my cat hiss. I opened my eyes and my cat was over the Ouija board hissing at it. My cat has hissed maybe twice in his entire life. I about pooped my pants and asked to say goodbye. I was already freaking out when I called one of my friends and they said 9 is an upside down 6. Now I am absolutely terrified. I have always been interested in the paranormal and going ghost hunting, as me and my friends called it. This story takes place on an October night in 2005. We had gathered at my dad's house for a party. We lived way out in the country, in an old farmhouse. We decided to drive up the road to an old cemetery because one of my friends showed up with a Ouija board. I said we weren't going to use it at my house, but I was game to use it somewhere else. About 6 of us piled into different vehicles and took off. When we got there, we set the Ouija board up on an old concrete barrier that surrounded the entrance of the cemetery. For context, the cemetery was set on a hill surrounded by cow pastures, fields, and trees. Across the road stood an old, white church. There were 2 security lights that lit the church area and the entrance to the cemetery. There was one more security light that lit the field next to the only house for about 2 miles. We all stood in a circle, planchette in the centers, hands all on it. My friend led the seance and asked if there was anything in the cemetery with us. At first nothing happened and we all stood still and quiet. Then the planchette slowly moved toward yes. Immediately we all started accusing each other of moving it, but everyone swore that they didn't. An eerie feeling fell over us as the planchette moved back to the center of the board. About that time, we heard what sounded like wind initially, but began to get closer. It sounded like the footsteps of multiple people running in circles all around us. We were all wide-eyed, looking at each other when someone said, "I'm out." Another person said, "We have to tell it bye or the spirits will follow." The leader of the group spoke to the board and said something along the lines of, "We are saying goodbye to you," and the planchette quickly jerked to no. It was pretty obvious by how shocked we all were that none of us had done that. Mind you, the sound of the footsteps are still surrounding us. The planchette moves to the center and we say bye again. Again, it moves to no, then back to the center. This time we all say it together, my friend's idea, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, moved the planchette to the word goodbye. We were relieved and took off running to the cars, which were parked at the entrance of the cemetery on the side of the road. Me and a buddy jump into my truck, and I hear my friend scream something about not being able to find their keys. She checks the ignition, her pockets. All our friends check the car and their pockets. No keys. Everyone else loads back into the truck, and we speed the 3 miles down the road to my dad's house. My friend searches her purse and pockets for the keys again, and again we couldn't find them anywhere. Eventually, someone takes her home, and she says she'll get her spare and get a ride back to her car in the morning. We were all too scared to go back and look that night. The next day, my friend searches the cemetery and never finds the keys, even in broad daylight. We hadn't walked around a whole lot, and where we used the Ouija board was very close to where we had parked our cars. Me and several friends scoured the entire cemetery over the next week or so and never did find them. My friend said she was 100% positive that they were left in the ignition when she got out of the car. It's where I left mine, and a common practice in the area where I'm from, which, like I said, is pretty rural. This was by far my scariest, but not the only, Ouija board experience that I have. In high school, my friends and I were messing around with a Ouija board one night. We had done it before, and nothing remarkable had ever happened. We usually did it to try and scare each other or our girlfriends. We all thought it was a joke. That night, there was no one else home except the 7 of us, and we were all together around the board. One of the girls there wanted to try it. She had never done it before. This time was different. The board misspelled some of the words the same way every time. It gave answers that seemed historically accurate for our town, things we never knew or never cared about. Long story short, the spirit claimed it was a 10-year-old boy who had died on the property in the 1800s, and was buried there too in an unmarked grave. My friend's house was on a farm in the edge of town. We were all a little freaked out, because the board had never been so detailed and consistent. However, we were still skeptical, and we were all assuming one of us was trying to scare the rest. Finally, my friend asked if the spirit could do something to prove he was there with us. It went to yes, and then spelled out knock. Then the planchette stopped moving. We all just stared at it silently, and then there was a rap, rap, rap on the window right next to us. The lights were on outside, and there was absolutely no one there. We never touched that effing board again. People often wonder what would happen if they used a Ouija board. Some people do it for fun, some people use it for spiritual communications. I can tell you now that if you have no experience in using a Ouija board, do not do it. This is a story about what happens when you use one for fun without knowing the consequences. When I was about 12, it was Halloween night, go figure, and we had just had a Halloween party for family and friends. A few of my older sister's friends stayed the night that night, and we were just hanging out in our room, which we shared. One of her friends had a spirit tethered to her. That's what she claimed. Whether or not it was true, I still don't know to this day, and she said, let's go for it. I wanted nothing to do with it, but being 12 years old and curious, I had to observe. They didn't follow any of the rules that you're supposed to as far as not putting it on a blanket, not lighting the proper candles, and other things that you're supposed to do prior to using the Ouija board. They were just calling on spirits that they could think of and trying to communicate with them. That's where things got a little creepy. If I remember correctly, one of the spirits that came to the board was a woman, and she was not friendly. She began to spell out profanities, and they quickly shut that down. I can't remember what the second spirit was, but it was also not friendly and called itself Satan. All of a sudden, one of my sister's friends began to panic. She said she saw a man out on the street with a red and black face. We did not see the man out on the street, so I don't know if she was having a panic attack and seeing things or what. The next event that occurred was kind of insane and terrifying. All of a sudden, my sister started zoning out and staring at nothing. We tried to get her attention, and she gave no response. Then she got up and walked downstairs, and we were confused, so we just followed her. We heard something in the kitchen, so we went and checked that out. My sister was standing over the sink taking knives from the counter in the knife holder, and she was throwing them into the sink one after the other. We try to get her attention again, and again she refuses to respond to us. Then she goes and grabs the coffee pot off of the coffee maker and drinks black coffee straight out of it. Mind you, she hated coffee at the time. She drank the entire thing. She got up and went to sit on the couch, and a couple of minutes later, she blinked and came to. She asked us why we were staring at her, and how did she get downstairs. To this day, she has no memory of what happened, and it is 21 years later. We're pretty sure that a spirit took over her body just to have some fun. My grandma, after my mom told her what had happened, came into the house and blessed it with holy water. It seemed to help for a while, and then I had the series of nightmares a year or so later, so I'm wondering if the holy water didn't really have much effect. So this is a lesson learned and a disclaimer to anyone who wants to mess with a Ouija board. If you have no real experience with it, do not go there. You never know what you're going to be inviting into your home. So a couple of years ago, I want to say like 2 or 3, me and my friend were bored. This was around the time that the Ouija board trend was going around on YouTube, and that kind of stuff has always, and still does, fascinate me. So we both decided to make a Ouija board out of a rectangle of cardboard that we cut off of a box. I believe we also made a ghetto-looking planchette out of cardboard too, with a hole cut out of the middle and everything. So anyways, we brought the thing into the basement of my house. Already a huge mistake, as I learned after. And we started messing around and using it. I don't even remember what we asked it or anything that really happened in detail, but I do remember being in such shock because I felt a strong connection, almost like a magnetic pull, pulling it down and moving it from underneath. Another thing that we both admitted to feeling after we played with it for a couple of minutes was a cold chill, only on our arms, that we were playing with. It wasn't really a breeze, but it just felt, well, bone-chilling. The point of this story comes into play now. That night I was in my bedroom, and I got up to go to the washroom, which is straight across the hall from my room, to brush my teeth and get ready for bed. I left my phone on my bed before leaving. So after I was done getting ready and all, I opened the bathroom door and immediately noticed that my room's lights were turned off. This threw up a red flag in my mind right away, and while I was scared, I just thought it was nothing and flipped the lights in my room back on. I went to grab my phone to distract me from the adrenaline and try to calm me down before bed, and I didn't see it on my bed. Or anywhere, for that matter. I got creeped out and immediately flipped the lights off and jumped into bed and hid under the covers. I tried to fall asleep, even though the thought that the Ouija board we had used earlier that day was in the closet about 5 feet away from me would not leave me alone. I swear I heard a faint knock from inside my closet multiple times that night, but maybe it was just my mind messing with me. The next morning, I wasn't as scared or freaked out as I was the night before, and I got up to take a shower. Once I got out of the shower and stepped out of the bathroom, my phone was right there, on the floor, right in front of me. To this day, it still troubles me, and I have no idea what happened that night. I haven't touched the cardboard Ouija again, but I did purchase a legit Ouija board like 3 months later, and have not really had any outstanding experiences with it, like I had with the cardboard one. When I was about 15 years old, I was a very curious teenager. I had only heard stories of the Ouija board, but had never actually tried it. So one weekend, my best friend slept over, and we decided to take our chances. My mom was super against me buying one, and she would have killed me if I would have brought one into her home. So my best friend and I took a big poster board and made our own Ouija board. We lit candles and turned off all the lights. It was about 1 a.m., and everyone in the house was asleep. When we started out, it was slow, but then the planchette started moving all around the board. I was convinced that my best friend was the one moving the piece around, but she denied it, and I trusted her not to lie. We asked how they died, and they just said, sick. After a bunch of other questions, we asked, how can you prove that you are who you really say that you are? They responded with, cemetery. I don't fully remember all the questions that we asked, but I know that it led to Charlie giving us some details. He said that his gravestone was by a path and a tree, small, round, with the year 1820. My mom's house is literally right across the street from a cemetery. I can look out the window and directly into it, so we are very, very close. It is an extremely old, historical colonial cemetery dating back to 1690. The next day, my best friend and I went over to the burial ground and started our wild goose chase for Charlie's headstone. Lo and behold, we found it. It was exactly as he described. His headstone was cylinder-shaped, the name Charlie was listed, and he was born in 1810 and died in 1820. Behind the stone was a huge tree, and it was right next to a pathway. I could not believe that the Ouija board actually worked. After discovering Charlie's grave, my best friend and I would sit and visit him every day after school. We would go hang out there when we were bored. Sometimes we would just sit next to him, smoke cigarettes, and talk. Maybe Charlie was just one lonely kid and wanted some friends. So that's what we gave him. About 2 years ago, my Nana brought home a Ouija board that she found at a yard sale. I have always been a true believer in the paranormal, and it's always been one of my peak interests. I have heard or read enough stories and watched enough shows to know not to mess around with a Ouija board, and quite frankly, they kind of freaked me out, so I wanted nothing to do with it. My Nana, on the other hand, doesn't believe in the paranormal whatsoever, and thought it would just be a fun game for myself, my brother, and the oldest of my 2 cousins. I left it on the dining room table for days before she made me put it away. I ended up sliding it under my bed in hopes of just forgetting about it. My brother, 11, and my cousin, 12, bugged me about it constantly because they wanted to play with it and I wouldn't let them. I tried to explain to them that it wasn't just a game, and that it shouldn't be messed with, but they were preteen boys who couldn't help but do things that they shouldn't. One day after I got home from work, the boys were there and I had this sneaking suspicion that they played with it. I looked under my bed and it was there, but I just had this odd feeling. That's when I went downstairs and interrogated them about it. At first, of course, they denied it, but I saw right through them until they finally admitted that they had in fact played with the board. I asked them if they had said goodbye when they were done, and they claimed that they did. My cousin likes to over-exaggerate stories big time, and makes things up to be overly dramatic, so when he told me about a couple of things that supposedly happened, I didn't believe him at all. Also, they were boys who liked to mess with each other, so I assumed that's what was occurring. Anyways, a couple of nights later I got in bed, and as I lay there trying to fall asleep, I got this feeling like I was being watched. I looked over at my closet, which has 2 sliding doors, and I noticed one of the doors is slightly opened, leaving a small space. It creeped me out for some reason, so I turned and faced the other way, trying to ignore everything and just fall asleep. I finally passed out, and the next thing I know, I'm woken up by what felt like someone or something hitting me in the back of the head. I was lying on my back, so the back of my head was fully on my pillow, which made it even weirder. And it wasn't a light hit either. It scared me so bad. I was shaking. I look around my room and I don't see anything, but then all of a sudden I hear my floor creaking like someone is walking around my bed. After laying there for a good little while, I finally got the courage to get up and grab my phone and book it to my living room. I sat and tried to calm down. I could still feel a tingling, pulsating sensation at the back of my head. I turned on my phone and realized it was 3 in the morning. I called my boyfriend, now husband, with tears streaming down my face from being so freaked out. He didn't pick up, and I swear I called him another 15 to 20 times before I finally gave up. I sat in the chair until my Nana got up around 6. I didn't tell her what had happened, because I knew she wouldn't believe me and would say I was acting stupid. After she got up, I had breakfast and then called my boyfriend again, and he finally answered. He told me he had his phone on silent mode so that he didn't know that I had been calling. I gave him so much crap for this, let me tell you. I told him what had happened and he felt so bad and felt like an idiot. He told me he would have come over in a heartbeat to comfort me and was so apologetic. Later that day, he came over and we took the Ouija board to a junkyard to get rid of it. My husband is the only one in my family that knows what happened, and I didn't experience anything again after I got rid of the Ouija board. So once again, moral of the story, Ouija boards should not be messed with. I had to have a Ouija board for Christmas. My wife refused to buy one, so I did it anyway. One night, when my wife was out, my daughter and I tried to use the board. Nothing. The planchette didn't move at all, or if it did, I could feel my daughter pushing it. As I suspected, it's just a parlor game. Move ahead 2 weeks. While working in the garage on a guitar amplifier that I was building, I had a very strong feeling that I was being watched. As I had spent many hours previously on this project without any sensations, this was disturbing. It got so bad that I couldn't spend more than a minute or so in the garage after the initial encounter without the hairs on my neck going up. Then came the whispers. More like a shh, shh sound, actually. Kind of a be quiet between 2 or more people lurking about. This only happened when entering the garage from the house, and later when my daughter called me at work to say she heard shh, shh when entering the darkened dining room. Since she was alone at the time, I blamed it on the cats. I too experienced it in the house, but usually only when entering the garage itself. Finally, I decided that enough is enough. I went into the garage one night and yelled at whoever was there that they had to leave because they were scaring the crap out of us. No more whispers after that. I wasn't yet into paranormal investigations at the time, so I didn't have a digital audio recorder to leave in the garage overnight. It bothers me now that I had real live spirits in the house to test with, and I didn't have the equipment or the moxie to do anything. This happened to my dad, who told me this story when I accidentally discovered a Ouija board in a closet in our house. He was living in Spain at the time, and during the 1970s, he bought that Ouija board. He told me that one day he talked too much with a wise entity who responded to everything so clearly and philosophically. The thing is, my dad asked it, "Where are you?" And the board started to mark random numbers and letters such as 1652AC, 8820, that kind of thing. My dad, who was consternated, thought that it was decontextualized. Nonetheless, and he cannot explain why, he wrote down the entire random series of numbers. And he cannot explain why, he wrote down the entire random series of numbers and letters on a paper that he had left sitting on a shelf. The disturbing part after that is that a few years during the 1980s later, my dad was watching Cosmos with Carl Sagan, and he told me that in that show, Sagan explained that scientists had discovered a new galaxy that was called with a sequence of numbers and letters. My dad was so impressed, so he copied down the name of the show and he looked for the paper on the shelf, and yes, it was the same sequence. My dad is fascinated with this experience and told me that the Ouija is not just spiritual, it is also interdimensional. When he told me, I was between scared and curious, and I considered aliens using the Ouija board. He still believes that this wise entity is up there somewhere, talking with others. This happened about a year ago in a park near my house. My brother and I are very spiritual and believe strongly in this type of stuff. I had this one Ouija board for a few years now, gifted to me by my old stepdad. We decided to use it one night and got in contact with a ghost. It went pretty well, and we did it again a week later. We talked to a new ghost, and the ghost from the first time. It was pretty cool and insane to experience something so real. They were very nice, and we were very respectful since we take this stuff seriously. Toward the end, we asked that they would not follow us home and that they would let us leave. They agreed, and we said goodbye. They moved the planchette, therefore they said goodbye with us. It seemed to be all going normal when we left, until my brother started noticing a weird feeling in our home, and on top of that, he said that one day he was hanging out in the living room and felt something in the room with him. It was on the couch where he was sitting, and he could see a cabinet door that he left open in the kitchen. He asked out loud that if someone was there to please close that cabinet door, and they did. After I got home, he told me this, and we busted out the board again. I know that you shouldn't use the board in your home, but I felt like we needed to know what was going on. We asked if the ghost who was in our home was the ghost from the park. The planchette moved to yes. Fast forward a year today, and we still live in the same house. We have a few experiences with ghosts and spirits in our home, but never the one from the park. Plus, I never go to the park anymore. My question to you guys is what made this follow us home? We did everything we were supposed to do, had a very friendly encounter, and they moved the planchette to say goodbye. I read that that's usually all that you need to do, but we did all that, and it still didn't work. I don't believe that the ghost was negative or evil, considering that they just left our home after a while. Or at least I think, since I don't feel them here anymore. My brother is convinced that the ghost was messing with us, since during the conversation when we asked their religion, they just muttered out a bunch of nonsense. I guess that could be it, but I'm wondering if there could be another reason that they followed us home. I was a senior in high school, and I always hung out with my sister, who was 5 years older than me, and her friends. That night it was us siblings, her best friend H, who was the same age as my sister, and our friend G, who was about 20 and enlisted in the army. We thought it would be a great idea, since it was close to Halloween, to play with a Ouija board for the first time. We got a Ouija board and decided to turn off all the lights in the house and light a few candles to really set the mood. So we sat on the floor of the living room and started our little game. I was sitting between H and G, across from my sister. It took a while, but we finally got a response when G asked if anyone was there. The planchette slid to yes. We kinda giggled because we thought it was one of us. But then it started spelling out Mama. My sister and I immediately go pale and make eye contact across the board. Our grandmother had passed away next door about a year prior to this. Before we could ask another question, the planchette spelled out the word love. We still weren't convinced. A little spooked, but not scared. G then asked the board, "How many children do you have?" And the planchette slid to the number 2, which is the correct number of kids that our grandmother had. It's important to know that G and H didn't know very much about our grandmother. They came into our lives after our grandmother had passed, so they never met her. The planchette then spelled out the words, "Roll Tide." Now we live in Alabama, and my grandmother was the biggest Alabama football fan. She would watch every game. The Alabama football catchphrase is, "Roll Tide." My sister and I immediately begin crying because it just seems so unreal. And then the planchette starts moving again. This time it's sliding around and going to the word, "Goodbye." I ask, "Do you want us to stop playing?" And the planchette quickly slides to yes. My sister doesn't want to stop. She asks, "But why? We want to ask you more questions." And the planchette quickly moves across the board to spell out the word bad. That was more than enough for me. I felt like if this was my mama, and she was telling us to stop playing, maybe we should take her advice and quit while we were ahead. She said bad. Did that mean that something bad would happen? Or that doing that was bad with the Ouija board? I don't want to find out. But after trying to convince my sister and friends, it did no good. The planchette keeps circling the board and going back to goodbye over and over again. Finally, everyone says goodbye because it's clear that nothing else was going to be discussed. But then, for some reason, I was talked into participating again. This time when something answered us back, the planchette moved across the board even faster, but it was between 2 letters only. Z-O-Z-O-Z-O. And that's all it would say. I don't know what the others felt, because we really didn't talk about it much. But to me, it felt like the room became colder. It was then unanimous that we did decide to say goodbye. We were shaking. Whatever we had just spoken to didn't feel right. My sister and I decided to sleep in the same bed. I remember lying in bed and being huddled together and just looking around the room. Every sound made me jump. I swear, I could see dark humanoid figures all around. Maybe it was paranoia, but I definitely did not sleep at all that night. I kept thinking about how Mama or whatever was imitating her had said bad, like it was a warning. My sister ended up getting rid of the board shortly after. I'm not sure what she did with it. I know her and some other friends tried to play with it again in a very old graveyard near our house with graves that dated back to the 1800s. While they were playing, they heard what sounded like footsteps in the woods around the graveyard, and what sounded like scraping on one of the headstones. I don't plan on touching another Ouija board again. I had just moved into a new place, and I was living alone. I bought a Ouija board and played with it my first night there by myself. Nothing really happened, so I stashed it in my dresser under some old jeans and forgot about it. A few weeks later I was having a party and suggested that we all play with it. Everyone agreed. I went to get it, but it wasn't there. I was dumbfounded. I'm pretty tidy. I know where I put it, but I could not find it. I couldn't explain it, so I just said that I had misplaced it. I had basically forgotten about it by the next morning. Fast forward 6 months. As I'm going to bed, I lie on my stomach. I slide my arms under my pillow to get comfy. My hand hits something. It's the planchette. I have no idea how it ended up there. I threw it out, and I have never seen it again, but I fear that whatever happened with the board, and the fact that I was an edgy teen, opened something up. I was into all that black magic crap. I've done lots of rituals with seemingly no results. There's a lot more to this story. Basically, my roommates and I were terrorized in two separate houses by something that we cannot explain. Like it was following us. All I know is that it looked like a little girl, but I don't think that it was. I never believed in this kind of stuff, but it's hard to deny what we all experienced. During the summer of last year, I was visiting my family at my grandma's house. I met up with my cousins and we decided to take the day to go out, eat, and catch up. After countless conversations regarding how my grandmother was still extremely religious, Muslim, we reflected on how we turned out not to be so religious and laughed. Until we had the brilliant idea of playing with the Ouija board in my grandma's living room, where, mind you, she had a chandelier that played 2 small verses from the Quran every time it was turned on. When we went back to the house, it was already nighttime, but we decided to wait a little longer before we began. Meanwhile, out of curiosity, we asked our grandma about the Quran lights. She said that her uncle had installed them about 6 years ago and that they had stopped working, reciting the verses, not actually lighting up the place. About a month after he bought them, and she laughed it off. Later, when we found that the living room was vacant, it was our perfect chance. We turned off all the lights and settled around the table where we placed the Ouija board and everything. We began the process, following the instructions carefully. After about 15 minutes of nothing, we decided that the Ouija board didn't work, and that we didn't have the true paranormal experience that we wanted. It was our first time playing, or trying to. We closed it up and I got up to go turn the lights back on, and the second I did so, the chandelier started reciting holy verses of the Quran. I froze in place and stared at my cousins, who looked just as shocked as me. I turned the lights off immediately and got out of the room while one of my cousins rushed to take the Ouija board out of the room as well. One of my cousins said that this is a warning from God, that a spirit had entered and that the Quran was pushing it away. I didn't believe him, but we turned the lights on again, and that time the verses didn't play. I thought it might have been a coincidence, a creepy one, but a coincidence nevertheless. My cousin grabbed the Ouija board and stepped back in with it, and she turned on the lights, and again the chandelier recited the verses. This time she looked at me and said that there was no way that it could be a coincidence. We all agreed that we wouldn't mess around with it again, and we threw out the Ouija board the next morning. The chandelier never recited the Quran again, and we never told our grandma about it. All this started when I was in middle school. I was young and stupid and seriously interested in the paranormal. I grew up in a religious home, and I am still religious. I have no explanation for what happened to me. I started experimenting with the paranormal with my friends. We thought it would be really cool to use a Ouija board. At first, nothing seemed to happen, but then the board started to move. We asked all the normal stupid questions like, "Who's there?" or "Is anyone here?" It moved really slow and steady. I was sure that my friend was messing with me. I got spooked and we threw out the board. But that is not where this story ends. Moving forward, I started having really weird nightmares. I would consistently wake up at 3 a.m. or not be able to sleep at all. I was basically a zombie throughout my entire day. There was one time when I was at home alone on FaceTime when I heard my mom yell my name. I yelled back and didn't get a response. My friend then reminded me that I was home alone. I immediately checked my whole house and no one was there. She heard the voice too, though, so it couldn't be explained. I continued hearing voices and knocks and was still unable to sleep. There was one time where I was in my room doing homework and someone pulled my hair so hard that my head actually yanked down. I got so spooked that I ran to my dad and told him what had happened. He obviously didn't really believe me. My brother started noticing weird things too, and that's when I got really uncomfortable. He and I were in my room, and I went to the bathroom. When I came out, his face was stone white. He claimed he saw a little girl run past my bedroom door. It couldn't have been me because I used the bathroom connected to my room. We don't have any other siblings. Another time, I was on FaceTime again with a separate friend, and I had my phone out in front of me when I walked into my bathroom. My friend asked, "What is that behind you?" And as soon as she said that, the lights shut off. I sprinted to my brother's room, and of course, nobody believed me again. The icing on the cake, though, was when I was asleep one night and I woke up suddenly. It was 3 a.m. again, and I was completely paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move. All I could see was a hooded figure in all black staring at me from the corner of my room. I couldn't see its eyes. I just knew that it was looking at me. It began to float toward me, and then pressed all of its weight on my chest. I couldn't talk or move. After silently crying for what felt like forever, I finally croaked out the word Jesus, and it fled from the room through my door. After that incident, I told my mom everything about the Ouija board and the experiences, and she finally believed me. She could see how scared that I truly was and knew that I couldn't be lying. She immediately got to work and blessed me and the house. I haven't had anything that terrifying happen to me since, and I no longer live in that home. I've always been pretty sensitive, and so have quite a few people in my family. I've seen dark figures, recorded a few voices, but nothing too major before this story. It was my senior year of high school, and I had been going through a period of what some may like to call paranormal investigating with my friends. We were spending time visiting cemeteries and abandoned houses, like most teenagers do. Just having fun being scared. Well, my friend Tyler found this Ouija board in an abandoned house that he had explored a month or so back and asked me if I wanted it. You see, he knew I was into the paranormal with all the love I had for being scared. I liked scary movies, haunted houses, and anything to get the adrenaline going. So of course I said yes. My friends Alex, David, and I decided to skip school, and I asked them if they wanted to use this Ouija board with me. They were along for the ride, and we had planned to find a place to do this. My house. My house was already known to be haunted because due to some experiences that I had had in my basement. So it seemed like the appropriate choice. Now my friend David didn't believe in anything paranormal. No ghosts or any of that stuff. So he decided to film this for us. Alex is sitting across from me, and I have my hands on the eye by myself. I figured you weren't supposed to do this alone from what I had seen in movies, but we did it anyway, just to see what would happen. Alex begins to ask some questions. Basic ones at first, like, is there anyone here with us? What's your name? What do you want? Alex then asks, are you trying to hurt Chris? And nothing really happens in that moment, but I do remember this distinct chill run down my spine. I brushed it off. We decided to watch the video back on David's phone just to see what it looked like. As we're watching this back, when it comes to the question of, are you trying to hurt Chris? In the video, my head tilts back and I say yes in 2 different voices. One in my own voice, and one in a deep, guttural voice. We all look at each other and exclaim, oh my god. You didn't say that. You didn't say anything. And needless to say, we got rid of that board and never really talked about it again. But that was one of the most terrifying experiences I have ever had. Ever since I was a kid, I had paranormal experiences. One intense rule of the house my mom gave me was never to participate in a Ouija board. When I was 14 years old, I'm now 20, I let my curiosity get the best of me and decided to do a Ouija board with a friend. In my room in the complete dark, we began the process. To my surprise, nothing happened. Later that night, I let my mind and fear get the best of me and decided to sleep with my mom, who had no clue that I had previously participated in a Ouija board, otherwise she would have killed me. As I was falling asleep, my mom asleep right next to me, I saw the silhouette of a large man in the doorway. At first, I told myself that it was just my brother. I called his name twice, then noticed that this figure was at least 6 inches taller than my brother and completely unresponsive to what I was saying. I started to panic and pray as I realized that this was not my brother and perhaps something far more evil that I had invited into the house. I was too afraid to move or to wake my mom. After about 5 minutes, though it felt like 10 years, the figure disappeared. I struggled to sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I was getting ready with my mom in the bathroom. Keep in mind that she has no idea what I had seen in her room last night, or even that I had done the Ouija board. She brings up to me a nightmare that she had had the previous night. After I asked her to tell me, the answer brought me to tears. She said that there was a demonic